I'm going to ask the jury chair, Peter Clark, and Dean Bay to join me here as we celebrate, honor, and present the award and hear from, and this is about to be your cue, the winner of the 2018 Ev Rogers Award, Professor Kathleen Hall Jamieson.
I've got it, thank you. That is heavy, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here to honor a distinguished scholar and to do so in the presence of so many colleagues and friends that I value. Walter Annenberg did indeed call the deans of his school and told us the school was going to change its name because he thought we'd gotten the preposition wrong at its founding, and the interpretation of the reasons are exactly on target. I'm here in the tradition that was set up in diffusion to talk about positive impact. So diffusion of innovation, diffusion of information, the ways in which we can ensure that that was used to increase health and well-being, to say there's another kind of diffusion now and we ought to be worried about it. I titled this talk something in the range of how our media were exploited in order to enable the Russian hacking and troll activities to influence the outcome of an election. Because I think we need to take the four in our title seriously and ask how the communication that we're engaging in right now may be increasing our susceptibility to a kind of diffusion that Ev Rogers understood well and his theory still explains, but that we want to interdict and not facilitate. And so to help do this, I'd like to start with today's New York Times. When we woke up this morning and we picked up our iPads, or in some cases we picked up our hard copies of the New York Times, we saw an article that was at war with itself in its description of what happened in 2016. Because the headline talks about meddling, and the headline says, State Department was granted $120 million to fight Russian meddling. It spent $0. But inside that article is a metaphor with very different implications. And in fact, you may not want to take it as metaphoric because there's the possibility that it is literally descriptive. And the word there that is operative is virtual war, engaged in a virtual war against the United States. Now, the difference between meddling and war and the actions that you take in response are highly consequential. During the 2016 election, our government and those speaking for it, as well as our press, accepted meddling and interference as the dominant characterizations. They did not use the language of war, they did not use the language of attack, and they did not use the language as a result of subversion and sabotage. In the process, the framing of that activity, both by our government and the people who spoke on behalf of it and our press, suggested that it was benign in some important ways, and that linguistic characterization invited a framing that throughout the campaign affected the way we saw the hacked content that came into our media stream from stolen Democratic emails. We didn't, of course, call them stolen Democratic emails. We instead characterized them as WikiLeaks, and then forgot the origin because the Russians had effectively used WikiLeaks as an intermediary, and we, not thinking war, we wouldn't be at war with WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks wouldn't be attacking us, did not have a frame around that to say what happened to those Russians whom on October 7th, our Department of Homeland Security and the Office of National Defense Intelligence had declared were in fact there. So the linguistic framing mattered, and those of us who were in the for business should have been on the front lines to say, wait, if you're not comfortable characterizing it as at war, at least indicate that it is not WikiLeaks that is responsible for this. You've got your origins wrong. And underlying the assumption of the press coverage was also the assumption that somehow there was an entitlement to know all of the things that were in private channels, although they reframed the election to an asymmetrical field in which you only had disclosures about one side. Hypothetically ask, what if we had disclosed emails from Michael Flynn, Donald Trump Jr., Kellyanne Conway? You can fill in the rest. And ask, what if we had some tax returns and medical records in addition? We didn't, but we lost track of the fact that we didn't because the framing had narrowed this into some kinds of entitlement to access that, of course, seems consistent with meddling. And there was, after all, no enemy state behind this. It was just WikiLeaks, which in other circumstances had elicited praise by opening up access to things that many approved of. So does the for in communication matter? Did it matter that the ambassador changed our name to of for? Yes, in both cases. And the first answer to the question that I would offer to you, how were our media exploited, is the framing capacity of our media through decisions made by our government officials and our reporters took a stream of content that was interpreted in a way that increased the likelihood it would be accepted and accepted uncritically by an audience. That frame also constrained Hillary Clinton's capacity to argue the Russians were behind it, and it inflected the debate about who was Putin's puppet. You remember the bizarre exchange in which Hillary Clinton, trying to put the Russian frame on this with no help from the press or from the government of Barack Obama, alleged that, in fact, what we had was Putin's puppet standing across the stage from her, and Donald Trump said, "You're Putin's puppet." So now we had a cross-puppet set of accusations in a context in which we did not have a Russian origin frame. That context meant that fundamentally, if framing does everything our literature suggests it does, gave people a different context for viewing this election. Let me answer the second part of the question, because there's another Russian stream of influence. The first is the hacking, the stealing, the theft, the sabotage. The second is the troll activity. If you wanted to be a troll, and I would ask you now to please join me in being a Russian troll, and you wanted to ensure that you could insinuate your material into the United States system almost seamlessly, you would want platforms that think of themselves as platforms, not as media outlets, do not consider themselves as gatekeepers, and as a result, do not consider that they may have any role in determining who's coming into this environment to reach anyone, and then, in addition, have anonymized practices that increase the likelihood that you can hide behind false identities, and are very effective at sustaining our engagement online as they continue to push us toward more like-minded content that becomes progressively more extreme. How did that structure of social media come into our system and essentially create an open invitation to engage in electoral sabotage? They were all but ready-made for it. I don't mean to suggest the social media platforms are not made for many more wonderful things, but that those sets of capacities can be perniciously used and were. We learned from the Mueller indictment of the 13 Russian individuals and the one individual, I believe, from California, who was selling identities, how easy it was to come into this system and to pretend to be someone else. And as we heard from people who were unwitting, that's Mueller's word, in their engagement with these individuals, what we see is the ease with which they could counterfeit identities in order to mask the fact that they were not actually in our like-minded community, but were manipulating those communities to do things that the communication field has understood for decades. Among them, reweighting the communication environment in ways that would increase the likelihood that the disparity in amounts of communication would weigh on behalf of one candidate rather than another. So now we have them using agenda setting by putting the content in, that's the hacking content, as well as the content from the trolls, framing with the complicity of the U.S. media structure, and also increasing the likelihood that we get a misbalance in information. I'm going to argue you see this across the campaign. So my answer is twofold to how were we exploited. We had media platforms ripe for exploitation. We had a press structure uniquely susceptible to framing because the underlying structure of media coverage in this country is toward appearance versus reality, the assumption that we don't see what we actually get in governance, and as a result, and in campaigning, and as a result, they were uniquely disposed to think that there was newsworthy content inside the hacked emails, because after all, they were private, now being made public, and the assumption of the move from public to private was a presumption of newsworthiness instead of a questioning of whether something was newsworthy. And they seemed remarkably unaware that in the process they created a one-sided frame, anti-Clinton, without ever counterbalancing with information about Trump, thereby creating a more balanced frame. And so information from the Clinton Foundation did not generate stories with parallel stories embedded that compared the Trump Foundation to the Clinton Foundation on exactly those same dimensions. What then happened during the campaign? I'm now going to try to do a quick analysis, and I'm going to assume that when I press this, something good is going to happen, because slides are going to appear on the screen. And, all right. I'm going to say they had a sound theory of the election. I'm going to say they affected the press agenda. They shifted opinion and vote. The shifts in opinion and vote preference were consistent with their activities. Making that causal link is highly problematic and very difficult to do, but at least we know that there was a consistent move, and the consistency is in the direction of the Russian activities, not against it. And it's important to note that there is no evidence anywhere in 2016 that the Russians were being effectively unmasked, because that was not coming into our media stream on the Hacked front, and it was not coming into the media stream on social media, and there was no counter stream trying to blunt their effects. So my theory is going to be, if they did something, it was going to be in Trump's direction. There's no evidence they created a backlash against him. But their theory of the election was sound. If it weren't, it wouldn't matter. So first, they did things like this in the media environment. You just said, there's this noise, and it just creates all kinds of affect, and we didn't know where it came from, but we knew it was bad. That was strategically set in order to create your anxiety, as we talked about, creating anxiety about cultural change. They targeted voters they needed to target. That's evangelicals and veterans to mobilize, black voters and Sanders supporters to demobilize, and they needed to shift the Stein supporters. I'm going to first take a look at cultural change. This is a really interesting study. I'm just going to telegraph it. Those who feel that the culture is moving against them were more likely to vote for Donald Trump. And if you say, what is the underlying psychological move of the efforts to get individuals on both sides of some debate to create moments that exacerbate tensions, it's this. It harnesses that in a way that ultimately will aggregate up those audiences to incentivize them on election day to vote for Donald Trump. So their underlying psychological theory was sound. This is the kind of thing that they did. Fears of cultural change. I'm going to move rapidly because I know that you can process the visuals very quickly. And part of the reason that that is important is because that increases their power. It decreases the likelihood that you will spot the Russian linguistic cues that say you are other, including the absence of the indefinite article, some very strange uses of punctuation, and an occasional statement that makes no constitutional sense whatsoever. But if you understand, as Larry Gross did when he pioneered the area of understanding visual imaging long before most of you were born, this is highly problematic content when it is being used deceptively. Now you see the tensions inside the culture, and the people who say this means they weren't trying to elect Donald Trump misunderstand something profound. To the extent that the incumbent is a Democrat, to the extent that the incumbent's heir apparent is the Democratic nominee, you raise cultural tensions around the status quo. You are creating an environment set to vote against that individual who is the Democratic nominee. They targeted the voters they needed to mobilize. If they got their psychological theories right, but they didn't reach the right person, they're not going to have an effect. But their theory of the election was sound. Evangelicals. And the move here is to start with benign content, use the links to aggregate the audience, and as you continue to appeal to the audience you've now identified, move to more extreme content. As you're liking, I'm beginning to aggregate you into the susceptible audience I will target with a massive push to vote on Election Day and during the early voting period. You're picking up Catholics, by the way, with the telegraphic signal of the Catholic medal on the bottom. Conservative Catholics are part of this broader group. Now the medal has gone upper screen left. Here you go with veterans. Now we've moved to being explicit about Hillary Clinton. I'm downstream in this stream because I don't have time to be upstream. Same move, but now to demobilize. I need audio if I can get it, please. If not, this is an
Hillary
actress.
Clinton is honest and trustworthy, and can we cut?
Cut. What's the problem?
I can't say these words.
What do you mean?
I just don't believe what I'm saying.
Okay, but you're an actress.
I'm not that good of an actress. Honest and trustworthy. Give me a break.
Make America #1 is responsible for the content of this advertising.
One of the troll moves, and a powerful move, was to take content already inside the U.S. media stream and amplify it. Another was to take content inside the media stream and distort it. But in the process, there's a credibility because you've already recognized inside the culture. You've seen this in other places, and so you're not likely to think that it's being increased in the weighting you give it because you're getting more exposure. So this is produced inside the U.S. system with legally gotten campaign dollars, legally spent, but the trolls are going to amplify it and push it to get it more exposure. You're also going to see things like this. Now I'm downstream on this. There's a synergy between the hacking stream and the troll stream. As you'll recall, the first major push into the democratic system with hacked content was right before the Democratic Convention. It was an appeal to Bernie Sanders supporters with content stolen from Democratic sources inside the DNC that showed that Hillary Clinton's folks had their finger on the scale. That led to the resignation of Debbie Wasserman Schultz, among other things. Those who say the trolls didn't create an effect, Debbie Wasserman Schultz would like to disagree with you. Also, there was a move to shift voters who would, if they vote on the liberal side for Hillary Clinton, over to Jill Stein. And it's with appeals like this. Trust me, it's not a wasted vote. The only way to take our country back is to stop voting for the corporations and the banks that own us. Grow a spine, vote Jill Stein. That's amplifying themes that are already out there, but this is troll-based amplification. So what we have first is they had the right psychological theory. The messaging was consistent with the theory. Create a backdrop of cultural turmoil, exacerbate your fears in the constituent audience, then begin to harness those in the direction of a vote against Hillary Clinton. This is much more an appeal against Clinton than in favor of Trump, which draws on all the literature that we have over the past 50 years, which says that negative information is more powerful, it's more quickly processed, it's more deeply processed, more quickly retrieved, and it is more persuasive. They then affected the press agenda. I'm going to suggest briefly, they affected the agenda around the Democratic National Convention, and that was largely a move to get the disaffected Sanders supporters to stay home. They affected it before the second debate. This occurred when the Access Hollywood tape appears, and within an hour, the dump of the Podesta emails blunts its effect on the agenda screen. They affected it through the month of October as the hacked content began to be placed across the news spectrum with a clever leaking strategy that ensured there was always something new. And remember, we don't have a Russian identification behind it, it's just WikiLeaks. And it affected during the last two debates, where two questions drawn by hacked content created a strong anti-Clinton frame. And finally, it may have affected it during the last 11 days. Here, the evidence is the weakest that I have. We will know more as more information becomes available. Let's start with the first. It's really simple. As a result of evidence from the hacked content, Debbie Wasserman Schultz resigned. That puts Donna Brazile in charge of the DNC. When the leaked content then later shows that Donna Brazile shared a debate question during the primaries, that fact was amplified by Donald Trump and by the trolls, and Donna Brazile loses her on-air job on ABC News. Now you have the second personnel effect that had discourse consequences within the media stream. An articulate African-American woman's voice is taken out of the media stream, and Donald Trump was handed a meme, which is they're colluding with the media. The Democrats are getting content to Hillary Clinton. The media is doing that. And you have a whole stream of content reinforced by the conservative media and sites such as Breitbart saying that, and now we draw out of more hacked streams. You see, they had this dinner that some media people came to, and now we're beginning to deepen the arguments that are already native to the right, that the media are left-wing, you cannot trust them, and that is a helpful line of argument to reinforce in case the media do decide to disclose that the Russians are behind that. Oh, wait a minute, they didn't, but nonetheless, it was preemptively important just in case. Affected the news agenda before the second presidential debate. Here's my example.
I'm Chris Wallace. Explosive leaks just before the second presidential debate. More hacked emails that show what Hillary Clinton really told those big bankers. And Donald Trump apologizing after release of a tape of him making lewd remarks about women.
I don't either way. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Key Republicans are fleeing the campaign and saying he should step aside. We'll assess the damage with Trump advisor Rudy Giuliani. And as some of Hillary Clinton's speeches to Wall Street banks are leaked, we'll talk to campaign manager Robbie Mook about how she'll handle the fallout.
Okay. Imagine that on that day, the Access Hollywood tape, which was released on the 7th, was the dominant theme inside news with no hacked content to counterbalance. I can tell you what the frame would have been because there's a third thing at play that day, and it speaks to my opening theme. At the beginning of that day, the Department of Homeland Security and the Office of National Defense Intelligence put out its report saying the hacking was attributable to the Russians. Had there been no Access Hollywood tape, that would have dominated the Sunday news shows. And the question would have been, how do you know that? Is this just an Obama finding? We would have actually spent some time talking about how they know, what they know, and that probably would have continued for at least a day or two as Republicans fought back against that frame, thereby increasing the likelihood we were aware that that finding was there. But that disappeared completely on the Sunday shows. None of the people responsible for that report were even interviewed on the Sunday shows. Instead, the Access Hollywood material moves out through the Washington Post. Within an hour and 10 minutes, the hacked content from the Podesta emails is dropped, and now instead of a Sunday frame that would have dramatically advantaged Clinton, here's this new report that says the Russians are behind the hacking, and here's the Access Hollywood tape. Now we have here's the Access Hollywood tape counterbalanced by revelations about Clinton. That reframing process is the single most important effect achieved by the hackers to that point in the campaign. Because had the frame stayed around Trump and not become counterbalanced with high levels of attention on it the day of the second debate, the debate happens that night, you would have expected as a result to have a strong, clear framing effect that would have lasted around the other hacked content as news evoked that frame to the content. So the first part of the effect is creating a counterbalanced narrative. We have revelations about both. So if you don't like both, okay, you still don't like both, but now we're not going to re-weight that to you dislike Trump more. But alternatively, it is doing something else. It is displacing the structural frame that could have contextualized the rest of the WikiLeaks content and never did. It's just starting to now, but it never did during the campaign. There's another effect.
So, John, what's her real view? Crack down on big money or kiss up to them?
Now, first, there is no good answer to this question. Which one would you like to have? But if there's one, it should be cracked down rather than kiss up. And the implication of the section they just showed was that she is in one category rather than the other. It is the one that disadvantages her. This is the public-private frame, and then within it, here's the contradiction, and this is the Bernie Sanders frame from the primaries. And as a result, if you're thinking about which voters are receptive to this, those are the Bernie voters who need to be demobilized if Trump is to win the election. The agenda was set through the month of October. Access Hollywood gets its hit, but WikiLeaks stays there the whole time. Agenda setting in the last two debates. This is from the hacked content.
This question involves WikiLeaks' release of purported excerpts of Secretary Clinton's paid speeches, which she has refused to release, and one line in particular in which you, Secretary Clinton, purportedly say you need both a public and private position on certain issues. So, two from Virginia asks, is it okay for politicians to be two-faced? Is it acceptable for a politician to have a private stance on issues? Secretary Clinton.
Okay. Now notice, WikiLeaks released. There are no Russians there. Public versus private, she wanted to keep them hidden. Then there is the quote that is being taken out of its context, and this came through the open debates process by which citizens supposedly voted that question into the queue for Martha Raddatz. Those of you who are studying bots, I would really like to know how many bots voted for that question, and I would really like to know how many trolls increased the likelihood that those inside our system cast a vote in that direction by telling others we've got this open debate process, push that question to the top. Anybody who's got the answer to that, please let me know. I am more than curious. If you know that what bots are able to do is surge a site in order to create the illusion of liking in very quick time, and as a result, increase the likelihood through a normative pressure that we come into the stream and say, I like too, and that we share too, this is at least a plausible hypothesis. It is the way the trolled content moved. It would be unsurprising if that effect were there. I hope someone looks at it to see whether it is. I have a pretty strong suspicion that this is a really good hypothesis. But the other thing that you're hearing here is the presumption of this is a frame. And the frame is difference between public and private that is consistent with the way press frames our politics. I wrote a book with Joe Capella called Spiral of Cynicism, Press and the Public Good. In that book, we argue that the press so strongly adopts a tactical/strategic frame, an appearance versus reality frame, that it only has to be activated. You don't have to create it from scratch. And that once it's been activated, it is so strong a frame that it influences the perception of content that has nothing to do with the news that has been framed that way. Specifically, we looked at actual news from the mayoral election in Philadelphia. We did studies across cities across the United States. We took out anyone who knew who won. We also took out those who thought that Rizzo had won. The person who had won was Ed Rendell, but we had an actual situation as a result where there was real news coverage, which we used in one condition. In the other conditions, we used the same reporter and on-air individuals from WPVI, Walter Anderberg's former station, who actually recreated the news pieces for us in the same suits and ties against the same background. A really tightly controlled message stream, in other words. And what we found was this tactical strategic frame, which looks at how you appear to be something to try to persuade people to do something, and how the polls matter in assessing whether or not that's the case, activated cynicism, depressed learning, and when they were given a debate by the actual candidates featured in the actual news, they were more likely to say things such as, that candidate won't do what the candidate actually says he will do. Since Ed Rendell was elected mayor, we actually know whether he did what he said he would do. He did, and as a result, you can't say that that was realism, not cynicism. In the case of that election, it was realism. He actually made promises he kept. Actually, most of the time, most people do try to keep the promises they make. There's surprisingly little turnabout from what you promised in campaigns and what you do in governance. You tend not to be elected when you make those kinds of shifts. So there's a schema out there, and we know from the framing literature that the likelihood that you're going to get persuasion effects increases when the content is consistent with an existing schema. The press has been feeding that schema. It is embodying it here. The likelihood that that produces effects is high. But there's one other thing that's important here. They have just digested a Clinton statement to take it out of context. In that debate, when Hillary Clinton explains that she was talking about the Steven Spielberg film in which an important president of the United States navigated us through the Civil War by talking to different constituencies in ways that let them find some ground they could agree to. When she says that, it sounds as if she's just looking for some excuse because the press has never said, here's the whole quote to show that the next line in her hacked, leaked, stolen speech segment is actually about Abraham Lincoln and about Steven Spielberg. In the absence of that context, this creates the frame. It looks in the debate as if Hillary Clinton is just trying to get out of a difficult situation. She's talking about Lincoln. You've got to be kidding. So now we've got Clinton looks as if in the debate she is verifying the notion that you can't really trust her. See how sleazy she is as she maneuvers around to reinterpret that content. And Trump, of course, says, Lincoln, you're a liar.
But, let's talk about what's really going on here, Martha, because our intelligence community just came out and said in the last few days that the Kremlin, meaning Putin and the Russian government, are directing the attacks, the hacking on American accounts to influence our election. And WikiLeaks is part of that.
Hillary Clinton is overstepping the statement made the 7th by the intelligence community. They did not attribute this to Putin. They attributed it to Russians. They wouldn't attribute it to Putin until later in the cycle outside the election itself. And they're not, and those statements themselves are also carefully couched. Nonetheless, she's got the gist of it right, and there's no news frame into which you are going to put this. This, for most people, the night of that debate is brand new information, very difficult to process because there's no underlying schema through which it processes, and it, as a result, lacks the credibility it would have had it been certified by news across the ideological spectrum. Had that been the dominant news of the day, you would have heard about that across the spectrum, but it wasn't because of Access Hollywood and then the Podesta email dumps. This is the next place in which we've got a problem. This is a speech to a bank, so we at least have bankers. There's the date. This is a hacked segment, a segment that comes from the hacking. And you see the period there? That's Face the Nation. And the statement says, my dream is a hemispheric common market with open borders, with open trade and open borders sometime in the future, period. There was no period in the segment. There was another clause. How did the media become accomplices in letting the Russians do their work? This is either bad reporting or someone, because of the brevity of news spaces, not knowing where an ellipses is appropriate and not understanding what the second clause meant and its implications for the debate about open borders, because open borders is for Donald Trump a word that defines his candidacy. And for Donald Trump, it means immigration, it means trade, and it means everything that is scary. For Donald Trump, what it doesn't mean is infectious diseases crossing borders, and it doesn't mean cross-border energy transfer. So you will be surprised to learn that that's what Clinton was talking about in the rest of that statement. Well, there are the ellipses, but you don't know what's missing in the ellipses. ABC got the whole sentence. Now, this one isn't hard. This one isn't like Lincoln, where you have to go to a next sentence. This is the same sentence. My dream is a hemispheric common market with open trade and open borders sometime in the future, with energy that is as green as and sustainable as we can get it, powering growth and opportunity for every person in the hemisphere. When we look at every other segment that is in the download, the dump from WikiLeaks, that is Russian stolen content from the Podesta email stream, what we find is that when Hillary Clinton uses this concept, it is either like this about cross-border energy transfer, or it is about infectious diseases. There are those ellipses. Now, the news framing, the day of the debate, is now creating the sense that that's what this was. So imagine that in the debate that Hillary Clinton is now going to say, no, I was talking about cross-border energy transfer. You're going to say, oh, really? There it is again. And the reason I'm walking across the Sunday shows is to say this was not simply Fox News. Actually, Fox News put ellipses in when there were some periods in there that shouldn't have been in there.
In a speech you gave to a Brazilian bank for which you were paid $225,000, we've learned from the WikiLeaks that you said this, and I want to quote, my dream is a hemispheric common market with open trade and open borders. So is that your dream, open borders?
Well, if you went on to read the rest of the sentence, I was talking about energy. You know, we trade more energy with our neighbors than we trade with the rest of the world combined. And I do want us to have an electric grid, an energy system that crosses borders. I think that will be a great benefit to us. But you are very clearly quoting from WikiLeaks, and what's really important about WikiLeaks is that the Russian government has engaged in espionage against Americans.
Now, there's no Russian metaphor sitting back, no frame back there. There's no espionage back there. Hillary Clinton's trying to put it in fresh in the middle of a debate after she's just told you that she said something you have no evidence she said from any of your exposure to the news stream that day. How plausible is that?
That was a great pivot off the fact that she wants open borders, okay? How did we get on to Putin?
Hold on.
No.
Wait. Hold on, folks.
So just to finish on the borders.
Yes.
She wants open borders. People are going to pour into our country.
Hillary Clinton was not talking about immigration, but you're not anchored anywhere on that, including from the moderator of the debate. This is bad journalism. How did the Russians manage to exploit and increase the likelihood that Donald Trump would be advantaged? Because we had a press that wasn't doing its job, at least in this instance. Amplification by the trolls. The synergistic relationship between hacking and trolls is profound. One of the things that the trolls did was magnified anything that would help Trump, magnified anything that would hurt Clinton, and in the process increased the likelihood that those in their stream of influence would see that unweighted environment. One of the reasons that this is important, and now let me go back to the beginning of the lecture, is that if you look at the polling data in summer, after the attacking of the Gold Star family by Donald Trump, what you find is that veterans appear unlikely to vote the way you expect them to vote if they go into the voting booth. Now, they're not going to come in large numbers and vote for the Democrat. They're likely to stay home if they're unhappy about their candidate. But the military families are nowhere near the percent that Trump needs them to be. You also find that the evangelical Protestant Christians are not anywhere near where you need them to be if you're the Republican nominee. And there is a reason for that. You have a thrice married candidate with sexual commentary that's highly explicit, that has now been made fairly visible in the middle of the campaign, who has engaged in some fairly explicit kinds of talk on Howard Stern, a place you probably don't think you'd like your children to listen to. Need I go on? And in case we haven't mentioned enough about the veterans, this is a person who had multiple deferments for, among other things, transient bone spurs. And so there are cues out there that are making it harder for those segments of the population to vote. If you reweight the environment so that Hillary Clinton is so awful that you will cast the default vote because you're not getting the weighting up on those things, our theories would say you're going to increase, at least on the margins, the likelihood that those people mobilize up. And if they mobilize to their historic proportions, Trump is now within shooting distance of winning in the election, and it's going to come back down to the late deciders. So let's look at the last days of the election. In the last days of the election, we have the reopening of the Comey investigation. Now, it's different to say it was reopened and to say we knew it was reopened. At the point at which he sends the letter to Congress, you know it will leak. At the point at which it leaks, you've got press coverage. And now we're back into something the press loves to do: speculate about what could be known under circumstances that if you just wait long enough will be known. And as a result, that controversy, what is there, what does it mean, with all the attendant priming of the word emails, which does not help Hillary Clinton because you've got email server controversy sitting in her backdrop, comes into play. And as a result, a reasonable theory is in those days, that's where Clinton lost the late deciders. The late deciders split decidedly for Trump in the close states. And the three close states decided the election in particular. High levels of late deciders, and they split decisively toward Trump. So what's in the media signal at this point? The debates are over. It's a Comey investigation. And during that period of time, there is no ostensibly new hacked information. So there goes my hacking theory. The trolls were still doing what the trolls were doing, but they should have been producing their effects all along. Even as, by the way, early voters are voting during this period and the hacking is having its effect. So there's some early voting effect before you get to the last days, but the big vote is going to be on election day. So how do I get the Russians into this last period? And if I don't, maybe you say, well, there's no plausible theory here because I can't nail down the late deciders. Here's the story. First, you've got the scandal. It's creating an agenda-setting effect. The framing is against Clinton. But where are the Russians? Here are the Russians. If Comey put the statement out to the Congress feeling the need to let them know that he reopened the investigation, and also possibly made the statement in summer about the investigation of the Clinton server, a statement which by historical markers is a strange statement, a statement you ordinarily would not have been expected to have made, because he believed Russian disinformation that said that Loretta Lynch had basically made some kind of a deal with the Clinton campaign not to prosecute. Then in the last days, we potentially have an influence of Russian disinformation that was forged, not hacked, from an actual stream. And if it turns out that that influenced Comey, then the case for electoral impact of the election on the Russians becomes much closer to a highly convincing case. We don't yet know exactly that occurred, but the Washington Post story certainly suggests it. Comey is writing a book. I only wish it would be out before mine has to go to press. Whether there is that last shift for that reason, I'm just going to put an asterisk on. If that occurred, then I can tell you the case becomes substantially stronger. If it didn't, it's historically interesting that it might have been possible to be continued. Nonetheless, what that reopened investigation did was shifted the amount of quote-unquote scandal coverage against Clinton. Now you've got your agenda-setting effect. And what happens with the electorate on the back end is consistent with what the trolls have done. That doesn't mean I think they're the only player in the stream. They certainly are not. The Trump campaign was trying to do exactly the same thing, as were those who were advocating on his side. The question is, in a close election, could the incrementing up to make the difference have been that activity? We have a history of studying communication, and we know these things reliably about it. When it produces effects, on average, they are small. They are not large. When they are produced, they are short-term, not long-term, unless they are reinforced. That is why I'm focusing on October, because our best information about decay says you've got fairly rapid decay of communication signals that aren't reinforced. That graph I showed you where it's up there is what I would call reinforcement. That troll amplification that is constant is reinforcement. And as a result, it's plausible to say that even though we don't think we get big media effects most of the time, even though they are short-term most of the time, the window in which they could occur was such that it's now plausible that they did occur in this election. Black turnout fell, white turnout went up. This is census data. And if you look at the baseline of the Stein vote from the previous election, the advantage being that she's a control. She's the candidate in both. What you see is there's a difference between the Stein vote then and now. Maybe those are other factors. We don't know this. But the shift is in the direction of hurting Hillary Clinton and benefiting Donald Trump as a result. You also see that veterans and evangelicals mobilized to their traditional Democratic-Republican level. That means the proportion was where it has been on its historical average. It wasn't before. Maybe they would have come home anyway. We don't know. But we do know that there was a boosting of the likelihood in the communication stream, assuming the targeting was well done. We still don't have exact information on the targeting to know that was the case. I've argued that our concept of diffusion now needs to accommodate the changing structures of media platforms that facilitate some kinds of movement of attitudes and opinions and information that can play games inside the body politic because of well-worn communication theories that suggest agenda-setting, framing, priming, and the reweighting of evidence matter. At the same time, the spiral of silence theory suggests, and there's one large-scale Facebook experiment that suggests it as well, that when you get this ramped up enough that you think your community is on one side, you do engage in more communication. The implication is that others still fall silent. That engage in more is a more reliable finding than the fall silent finding, but nonetheless it sits there. In that environment, we need to ask, in the tradition of Ev Rogers, what kind of scholarship do we need to understand not simply how we diffuse what is good, the innovation and the information that helps save lives through health, but how do we theorize, understand, and then protect ourselves from the more pernicious uses? I'd be happy to take comments or questions, and I know some of you have to go to class. Thank you. Anybody?
So, if the Russians were so good at gaming our system, what's your theory on how they got to know our system so well?
I ran an exercise that said, how would you figure out by using publicly accessible sources which audiences to target? And I pretended all I knew was how to search the internet and that I was fluent in English. Both problematic assumptions, so I may have been a little bit slow. And what I found within about 4 to 5 minutes was that I could get enough punditry aggregated because of the tactical and strategic framing of news to be told not only which constituencies need to be mobilized, which need to be demobilized, but where I could find them, what had already been done to them, how Trump was trying to manipulate them, how Clinton was trying to counteract them. You don't need collusion to know that. Essentially, that is public. And it is a weakness of our system that we spend so much time on it that the answer to your question can be just pay a little attention to a news stream and you're going to know it. The second answer to the question is that built into the structure of our platforms are ways of reaching audiences that are so much better than anything a sophisticated media targeter could do before this. You had to pay people to buy time because they knew how to reach target audiences by their time buys. You don't have to do this anymore. Make a list of all the ways you can target, and these are public ways. Again, you don't have to collude to know this. You can target, and you can target in ways that will reach these constituencies because the media are already telling you what they look like. So they're telling you, these are older, these are white, these are. And these are the cities and places. You can target by geography, you can target by ideology, you can target by education, you can target by age. You can target by all the like-minded signals you give inside the consumer stream. All you have to go is into the existing publicly available structure and say you want to buy something, and you are suddenly given state-of-the-art strategic access to the best available targeting, better than anything a human could have done on his or her own before this. The only question then is, was that incremented up through additional sources of information? And there you've got the question of what's their coordination. But you didn't need it to get to this part of the analysis. This you could get out of public sources. So for two reasons, the accessibility of the information on the platforms and all about how-to guide on how to do it well. And then the platforms give you the feedback on effectiveness. So in the past, you'd put your media out there and you kind of wait to see how the votes shifted or the polls shifted. Now you've got an immediate sense because you know what's liked and what's shared. So it's as if we created a way to test messages for people who know nothing about our system so that across time they could refine those messages in order to ensure that when they needed to surge into the system with appeals to activate, they had the right people and they weren't inadvertently activating anybody who would vote against their side. If there are no other questions, I'm going to tell you stories about Larry Gross.
So you give a good account of the flaws in the system that were easily available to be taken advantage of, the incompetence in a real sense of our media in falling into various traps. The Russian element here, it strikes me, if you want to put it in historical perspective, needs to acknowledge the fact that we, in this case the United States, have been meddling, probably with less finesse, in elections around the world for decades. In fact, countries do it all the time, but the U.S. has, as I think you know, been doing it more than most and fairly openly. I mean, the Hondurans don't think it's a matter of Facebook and bots that are involved. So I think if you're going to do this, you know, and I gather a book is coming out, I would be wary of falling into the easily available frame of the Russians as the, you know, the villain behind the screen. You know, as I think you've just illustrated, we were asking for it in a sense. And if you need a villain, you could also, as is happening nowadays, blame Facebook and Twitter and other companies that are happy to be, you know, profiting on this, you know. CBS, you know, right here behind me, I think that Les Moonves pointed out that Trump may be bad for the country, but he's very good for CBS. So there's a way in which all of this was taking advantage of a profit system which was completely either ignorant of or callous in not thinking about the consequences of the platforms they were making available.
You know, I agree with the vulnerabilities in the platforms, and the extent to which the platforms downplayed this initially is really troubling, because if they actually only knew what they said they knew when they said these numbers were very low, gee, it took them an awful long time to get the other numbers. And if they were covering it up, that's a problem too. But every piece of new information they have to disclose suggests wider penetration and reach and more sophistication than the initial dismissal. On the larger point, not only has the United States meddled in other countries, it's increased the likelihood that leaders of other countries with whom we disagreed strongly met an untimely end. So, you have to go back across our history and say, no, we are not, the virtuous group here that was victimized by the evil other. But here's the question. If we're so smart about doing that, how do we let it happen to us? So this actually raises the question, were we in this domain of meddling in other countries, or are we still off doing all the other things that we've historically been so dexterous at and only caught when the Church Commission revealed some of them to the shock of many people in the American public? So I don't mean to suggest that I think that we have not been doing other kinds of pernicious things, but rather that I worry that our level of pernicious activity is not high enough for us to be aware of how we could be used, and then I worry about the ethics of doing it in both places, or multiple places. Yes?
I attended a briefing last March at the NATO High Command, where the Riga, Latvia NATO Security Center reported on findings that said the Russians were systematically doing this in Finland, the Netherlands, France, Germany, often with very specific intent. For example, in Germany, trying to decrease public support for their military more explicitly than trying to flip an election. So clearly it seems that they are engaged in a very systematic attempt. And if this doesn't become a NATO Article 5 violation and prompt some kind of response, it seems to me it undermines the very principle of the Western alliance.
Yeah. And we are now more recently made aware of the extent to which there has been Russian troll activity inside our agri-streams, trying to increase skepticism about GMOs, actually genetically engineering products would be a better way to express it. We also have evidence that they are involved in the anti-vaccination movement and in trying to minimize the likelihood that public opinion accepts anthropogenic climate change. So this is not a one-front activity. And the reason that I like the war metaphor is because you then have to specify the war against whom, about what, with whom, where. And you suddenly start to say, it is not right here alone, and we were not the first to have an effect. But we are seeing, as it moves across different nations, different kinds of capacities are emerging. And we are also able to learn from them. France managed to interdict this in a way that the United States didn't because it was aware of what happened in the United States. It also has a completely different structure, and it does not have a First Amendment. So the French organization that's responsible for elections, we don't have anything that's comparable, put out a statement when Macron was hacked and basically said, anything that's false, you're accountable for, media. Well, it effectively meant the fact of hacking was covered, but the content was not. We can't do that here. We have a First Amendment, and we have to cherish our First Amendment. But we're suddenly able to see if we can get the peace, and USC has led the way in some important instances here. We've got to have a global communication community that analyzes this in very specific contexts with the language capacity and also the capacity to share what we know about each other's use of technologies, because the underlying technologies are common. I mean, bots perform the way bots perform. And some of the best research that's been done on the US election has been coming out of other countries who are taking their capacity to understand, driving it through our system, in part to mine it, to help understand what's happening globally. This is a time that having two Annenberg communication schools means that we have a special obligation to be working with each other, as well as our global partners, because this affects virtually everything that we do in the health area and in the political area. And this school has been historically known as the tech leader in the field. So to come here and talk about the new technologies is, to me, to be in a one-down position dramatically, because you've got expertise here that I know I do not have access to. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring this here, because this is still work in progress, was to get any feedback that you've got about the assumptions underlying this that might be faulty. Yes? The question is about the 2018 elections. I am alarmed that we have not taken advantage, and that's the reason I started with the story in today's paper. There's money available for us to be responding effectively that has not been spent. There is an agreement that now appears to be in place to get a block of it spent. It is almost too late to spend this, and I haven't dealt with the problem with not having effectively hardened our electoral systems. There were either 21 or 39 systems hacked. 21, the official statement; 39, what is being said privately in some circles. That means that, and data was taken out of 2 of those systems that we know of, including materials that potentially could have created vulnerabilities that, as best we know, were not acted on. But apart from these communication streams, the best way to change the outcome of an election is to enter into the digital stream and alter the vote. or mess up the registration process so dramatically that you don't know what it means. And you don't actually have to do that to create a problematic outcome. You just have to demonstrate that you could have done it or suggest that you did it in an environment in which people are highly distrustful of everything in government and do not trust each other. And now the Secretaries of State stand up and say, we weren't, and you say, you're a Democrat, you're a Republican, and now we are first not going to be addressing the problem the way we need to. But secondly, we're not going to have a public that's going to believe us if we have. So that is equally problematic, less in our area of expertise in this room, but nonetheless something that we ought to worry about. And creating the illusion that you can't trust is sufficient. And I think they've demonstrated capacities to do that. Some wise person said that Putin wins if he gets us to assume there is no such thing as the knowable, the fact, the truth, and as a result is able to set us into environments in which we can't deliberate. We cannot use the strength of our system of government to get the best possible outcomes. And my worry is that we are now seeing the capacity to do that. The 2018, if we haven't done more than we've done at this point, we may see what the next iteration looks like, with 2020 being a Bush v. Gore without a capacity to count chads and ballots, because there will be only a digital stream and we won't know what we've got. With that, I'm going to thank you for the opportunity to speak. Thank you for this wonderful award, and thank you for being such good colleagues and friends.